Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Welcome, Janelle. Welcome to the program. How are you today?
Thank you so much. I'm great. Good to be here.
Great to have you. What I wanted to start with, since you have so many incredible projects that you're working on, is what is most exciting to you right now?
I could give you a very specific one that right now is very exciting. And then one that tends to be exciting over the long term of many weeks. One, this is going to sound really random, but that's part of what I like about it is I'm really fascinated with cemetery law because I had this interesting thought, which is what if we can get people to take the money they would otherwise spend on their funeral or buying a cemetery plot and put it into land conservation right now? Because a funeral is the third largest expense that most people have, according to the Federal Trade Commission. It's like a house, a car, and then your funeral. And we're wasting all this money on a lot of unsustainable practices, paying large corporations that have really come to dominate the industry. So I thought, let's get all that money out of those big corporations, get everyone who's alive today to purchase their burial plot by putting in, say, $5,000, and we could just conserve tons of acres all over the country. So using cemetery finance as a land conservation tool is a research area for the Sustainable Economies Law Center right now, researching all of the financial regulations that govern cemeteries.
What a beautiful introduction to the multifaceted ways that the SELC interfaces with our legal system.
Well, thank you. And I guess in the sort of on a longer term basis lately, we've been really excited about worker self-directed nonprofits and just in general, the future of governance for nonprofits. And our organization has a really unique structure that hopefully we can get a chance to talk about it a little more. But basically, we're kind of a hybrid of a nonprofit and a cooperative. All of the 12 staff at Sustainable Economies Law Center make the same salaries. We all have roughly equal power to influence the direction of the organization. Plus, we all have a lot of autonomy in our respective areas of work. So it really moves the organization very efficiently. It gives everybody a strong sense of ownership, which I think in the end is much more effective at advancing our mission. And so we've been helping other nonprofits implement similar models. And it's just, I think it's very transformative for people, especially those who have worked in the nonprofit sector for a long time, who just kind of feel liberated by this new governance structure.
So for our listeners, talk about the importance of cooperatives and what that actually means.
Okay, cooperatives, my favorite subject. Sometimes I boil cooperatives down to just two principles because the word cooperative is kind of insidious in and of itself because it sounds like a really nice thing. It just sounds like really friendly and it's like a nice thing to do. So I like to boil cooperatives down to two principles, which is that money doesn't buy power in a cooperative and money doesn't buy profits, because cooperatives by definition operate on a one member, one vote basis. The members could be workers of a business, they could be consumers of a business, but what's important is that it's democratic, so nobody can come in and buy shares and gain more power than others. And then money doesn't buy profits, because in a cooperative, the organization is designed to operate at cost, and if it generates profits, they're distributed back to the members on the basis of their patronage, which in a worker cooperative means how much work each worker did for the cooperative in a fiscal year. In a consumer cooperative, it's how much did people purchase. But the idea is that nobody can come in and buy a lot of shares of the corporation and get profits solely by virtue of having the privilege to have invested in the cooperative. So in a world where wealth has already become so unequal, if we let money buy power and we let money buy profits, then the wealthiest 10 to 20% are just going to get more and more power and more money. And things are already very unstable. But cooperatives have the potential to turn that trend around.
How likely is it that we can see more people adopting cooperative models? And also maybe share a few examples, maybe how it looks in the CELC, how that kind of equalization functions at the CELC, and maybe some other examples in your work that you'd like to share.
Sure. I do think we are about to hit a tipping point. I've been working with cooperatives for about 9 years, and I'm frustrated that from 9 years ago till now, there haven't been a lot of cooperatives emerging. I was thinking there'd be millions emerging. So that hasn't happened yet, but I actually do feel us starting to get toward a tipping point because so many people have become aware of wealth inequality. People are feeling and getting firsthand experience with the effects of displacement of communities. And so when we make improvements to our neighborhoods, the property values rise and longstanding neighbors get displaced, people start to ask questions like, what about this dynamic of gentrification and displacement? What can we do about it? And if you really want to get to the root and find an answer to that, which is not easy to do, eventually you do come down to the economics of how property is owned and how businesses are owned, and recognizing that it just privileges the wealthy over and over again. And so people eventually make their way around to the idea that we need a different way of owning businesses and a different way of owning property, and they get to cooperatives. So I think we're all about to get there to the point where consumers will stop shopping at businesses because those businesses are not cooperatives. And that's what I hope to see as a consumer movement, really driving the development of cooperatives, because we recognize this is what's going to be good for everybody in the long term. So I'll give an example of a client we work with called Economies. And we started working with Economies in response to what we were seeing emerge under the umbrella of the so-called sharing economy. This is a couple of years ago, but of course, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Lyft, Uber, all of these tech platforms were emerging and creating work opportunities and income earning opportunities for people that felt liberating in many ways. And a lot of people who were out of work were finding these platforms to be really helpful, and it was creating kind of a new way of working that was much more flexible. And so there were a lot of positive things coming out of this. But there's also this inherent flaw that these companies are owned by wealthy shareholders, and those shareholders, and by the design of the company, get more profits the more they can squeeze out of the workers. And so there's always going to be this inherent conflict between the benefit of the workers and the benefit of the shareholders in the design of these companies. And we've seen it play out already where, for example, Uber drivers have made less and less of a commission over the years. TaskRabbit, for example, takes 30% of a TaskRabbit's pay. So TaskRabbit is a platform that enables people to do all kinds of tasks, handy person jobs, home cleaning, running errands for other people, and get paid for each of those jobs. And TaskRabbit's taking 30%. And so along comes Economies, which was founded by a guy named Josh Danielson and a handful of other co-founders. And he came to the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and he had basically built a platform very similar to TaskRabbit, slightly more driven by the needs of freelance workers who, massage therapists, home cleaners, in-home care providers, dog walkers, who can post their services on the site and get clients and get paid for those services. So very similar to TaskRabbit, but Josh said, basically, we want this to be structured as a cooperative owned by the people who are actually doing the work. the freelance workers. And so at the time, it was a business owned by 11 shareholders, most of whom had gotten stock by means of working for the company. But we converted it to a cooperative corporation, and that cooperative corporation has a few categories of members. The largest group of members is freelance workers. There's also worker cooperatives, can be members of Loconomics, because one of the goals of Loconomics is to just remove the middleman, remove anybody who's in between a producer and a consumer who's trying to extract value from that transaction. So removing the middleman means that individuals can offer services through Loconomics, worker cooperatives can offer services through Loconomics, but people who have a business and hire employees and potentially exploit those employees cannot become members and offer services through Loconomics. So these members elect the board of directors. They also get dividends when there is a surplus of revenue. And the staff of Loconomics is structured in such a way that every staff member, at least after a period of time of working for Loconomics, has a responsibility to be directly accountable to the membership. So we call it staff trusteeship. Each staff person takes on the role of a trustee, the duty of care, the duty to listen to their needs and respond to them. And that duty comes along with a high level of responsibility, but also power. So there's a very equitable power structure that we're designing into the workplace culture of Loconomics.
That's great. I think it speaks to the point of, is it important to have cooperatives like the SELC that are considered multi-stakeholder? So what is a multi-stakeholder cooperative and how does that look at the SELC?
So a multi-stakeholder cooperative usually refers to a cooperative that has basically different stakeholder groups as members, aka owners of that cooperative. And so a common example is a grocery store that has both worker owners and consumer owners. There are a handful of especially old school cooperative developers and activists who don't like this model because they say it creates an inherent tension between the two stakeholder groups, which is true. At the same time, that inherent tension exists in the world already. We're not going to eliminate that tension. What we're doing is actually creating a space in which we can navigate them and try to come up with fair ways of navigating it. And so a multi-stakeholder cooperative creates governance structures that bring in the voice of consumers or bring in the voice of workers. Going back to Loconomics, there are 6 categories of members in Loconomics, and I won't describe all of them, but 2 of them are the workers of the company itself, the employees of Loconomics, and the independent contractors of Loconomics, because accountants, lawyers, and sometimes software programmers work as independent contractors, but we want them to have a voice also. The vast majority of the control, though, is in the hands of the freelance workers, the worker cooperatives. That is an example of a multi-stakeholder cooperative because we don't want to create a cooperative that on one hand is designed to benefit freelance workers in society, but that exploits the employees of the company itself. So the Sustainable Economies Law Center, we are actually a nonprofit corporation. We're tax exempt under 501c3. But we function as a cooperative, and the primary control is in the hands of the workers, which could at first glance sound like an inherent tension because nonprofits are designed to benefit the public. Nonprofit public benefit corporations, their purpose is to be outward facing, thinking about benefiting the public. And so it brings up this question of, well, if you put workers in control, aren't they just going to be benefiting themselves? But what we found is that, of course, the people who come to work for a nonprofit have a lot of motivation to actually make a difference in the world and carry forth the mission of the nonprofit. And we find that we actually do a better job than, say, a hierarchical nonprofit might, because there tends to be this assumption in the mainstream nonprofit world that we need a board of directors at the top, and that somehow this board of directors that maybe meets on a quarterly basis has the ability to be tuned in enough and to make wise enough decisions about what the nonprofit should be doing. And then if it doesn't, it hires a CEO, an executive director, who presumably could be in a position to do that and hire managers and other staff to do that. But as long as you keep the power up at the top, the people who are on the ground doing the work, whether it's direct client services or movement building work, the people on the ground are the ones who are best able to sense the needs of the clients, sense the needs of the movement of the community, and propose the direction of the organization or propose actions to take that best further the work of the nonprofit. And so when you have a hierarchical organization and you have someone on the ground who says, I really think the clients need X, it has to go up the chain of management to the executive director, sometimes through the board, back down through the executive director in order for anyone to even take action. I know a lot of people who work in nonprofits who just feel like they're stuck. They see the vision, they see the mission of the nonprofit, they have so many ideas, but feel like they can't actually move toward them, and it becomes very unsatisfying. People get burnout. So in our organization, I wouldn't call us a multi-stakeholder cooperative, really. Like, our sole focus is to benefit the public, the planet, people. But creating a healthy workplace is also part of that, because if we have unhappy workers or workers who feel exploited, we're much less likely to be caring and empathic toward other people. And I think our sense of caring is what gives us intrinsic motivation to go out in the world and do good. So I think we need to be cared for. And so creating a healthy workplace is part of that, but also just giving each worker the power and responsibility to be advancing the mission as best as we possibly can, I think is way more effective in the long run.
Thank you in your own way for doing the due diligence to be proactive about preventing burnout over the long haul. I actually have a background working for nonprofits, and so know how prevalent that is. I want to go back to now kind of the work that the SELC does, fueled by this incredibly empowering model. And what I love that you said about this importance of recognizing in a cooperative both the voice of the consumers and the voice of the producers, or the voice of the workers and the voice of the consumers, is that it really does bring to light the importance of collaboration. And so let's talk about that. What does a sharing economy look like?
A sharing economy. I think sharing is the new sharing, as in sharing control of organizations, sharing the fruits of our labor, sharing the benefits that we all create together, which comes back to cooperative models. But I think in a true sharing economy, we're sharing power in ways that just create many centers of power throughout an organization, throughout our community. I like this word polycentricity. I don't like using big words, but polycentricity to me means creating many centers of power. And this Nobel Prize winning economist, Elinor Ostrom, who studied commons around the world, basically she looked at communities throughout the world and throughout time who have been able to share effectively, so they manage a resource together as a commons in the long term and make it sustainable in the long term. She looked at fisheries, she looked at grazing lands and people who are sharing those resources, and found that there were certain characteristics that made them actually very sustainable and effective in the long term. And the core thing that I took from that is that decisions have to be highly localized. The people who benefit from those shared resources really need to share in the decision making and the monitoring of those resources. She created these principles that basically point to that. And she said creating many centers of power is important. And I've said this for a long time. We all can say this. Democracy is really important. We can give lip service to democracy and say, yes, it's important to hear everyone's voice. But I think over time that has really started to feel true to me, like down into my bones, because I think if we are ever going to effectively steward ecosystems, if we are actually going to care for the people in our own community and care for our urban environments, and it requires that every person be very intrinsically motivated to do so, and that it inspires our sense of caring. And if we have these top-down kind of technocratic ways of managing resources, managing ecosystems, managing communities, people don't have that sense of ownership. And when you don't have a sense of power and ownership, it doesn't inspire that more nurturing relationship. So all of this is to say, I feel like we need to share power and decision making. We need to push power down to the level of every single individual, because if we don't give every individual a sense of that they have something that they are taking care of and they're participating in and nurturing, I don't think we're going to inspire the kind of stewardship that we need to actually survive on this planet.
So that brings to mind a really important issue right now that I wonder if we could talk about, which is land access, sharing those principles you laid out. And maybe if you could share some examples that you think are working right now to address, obviously, the barriers, particularly in the Bay Area where we're both based, around land access, maybe in affordable housing, maybe in housing, but also maybe in farming.
Yeah. I have to say, I've been working in the realm of shared housing and eco-village development for about 9 years as a lawyer, both in private practice and with the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And there was a long period of time where I was discouraged because I started to feel like, really, if we don't find a way to manage land and create equitable access, we're doomed to failure for all of our social justice movements. Mm-hmm. And also feeling like I hadn't seen a solution that was really taking hold and gaining momentum. And I just got kind of frustrated for a while. And there are models that are very promising or that make really significant strides. One of them is community land trusts, because one of the essential things that community land trusts do, they tend to be nonprofits that hold title to land. They often create housing and sell the housing on that property to people. So it's very much like home ownership that they're creating, but they're doing it in a way that limits the equity that people can build in their properties. It stabilizes the price of the land and the housing, and it basically takes the land off the speculative market. It stops treating land and housing like a commodity and starts treating it like what it is, which is land and housing. And because I think the speculation, real estate speculation, is what's causing communities to be displaced. It's what's driving the increasing wealth inequality. And so the very fact that community land trusts are taking land off the speculative market, that's part of the solution. And so a lot of people point to community land trusts as that's part of the solution. And I think it is. The frustrating thing is we've, had community land trusts around for 30, 40 years, and they haven't grown very fast. And each land trust doesn't acquire land that fast. And one of the problems is they tend to be 501c3 nonprofits, so their access to capital could be limited. So we've started working with a client to implement a model of home ownership that we're calling the permanent real estate cooperative. It's just kind of a phrase that we wanted to give to what we were doing to kind of set it apart from what's been done before. And it takes a lot of the same tools that community land trusts use to take land off the speculative market and put a cap on the sales price of it. But as a cooperative, it's not limited to serving only low-income people. Like a 501c3 tends to be limited to serving low-income communities. And I think that it can further the divide among people. And what we really need is an attitude for everybody, high income, low income, no matter what, that none of us should be treating land like an investment or like a commodity. We should be treating it like a place to live and make our livelihoods. And so a cooperative doesn't have that restraint. It doesn't create that divide that charities often do between the people who are helping and the people who are helped, which I think can be very disempowering and sometimes a little disrespectful. And so the idea with a cooperative is we are all in this together. We are all organizing this for our own benefit collectively, which I think is much more empowering. And then the last thing about this model is it's designed to be decentralized organizing model. So rather than having a board of directors at the top that's driving the decisions about what pieces of land to acquire and who's going to live there, people can form organizing groups at the grassroots level, start looking for housing together, start strategizing around how they're going to raise money for that housing, shepherd that land and housing into the cooperative, which would hold title to it. But what that enables is potentially hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people to be out there actively organizing to get their own housing and also preserve that housing, take it off the speculative market. So I feel like this is a model that has the potential to scale. I think the cooperative model over the nonprofit model has the potential to scale and create more equitable relationships.
Is there a way that people can get involved or start thinking about in their own organizations or personal lives how to be a part of that scaling?
Yeah. Well, no permanent real estate cooperative exists yet, but once they start to exist, I think people should be part of them, and not just as passive members, but very active in organizing. But people should start these cooperatives themselves, so start getting organized. And also, I think individually, what each of us can do right now is just let go of any expectation that our path toward wealth is going to be home ownership. Because if we see the injustices that creates in the world, and if my plan is to buy housing and to hope that it appreciates greatly in value that I could then cash in on, it means that what I'm cashing in on is the driving out of lower income people from my neighborhood. Once we see that, it doesn't feel good, and I think we just need to let it go, which creates a huge question, though, because so much of the American dream is based on this, and so much of the wealth that families have been able to accumulate has been based on home ownership. But there are other ways to create wealth, and I think what we need to do as communities is come together and think about other ways of providing for each other and not letting this very inequitable housing market be that thing. So yeah, I don't own a house yet, so my goal is either to form a permanent real estate cooperative that I could be part of, join one once one exists, and shepherd housing into that cooperative, which means me actively giving up the ability to profit off that land. But I think that just gives us a much firmer moral ground on which to live as well.
Your words are echoing so much of the conversations that are happening in my community. So thank you.
That's
You're
great.
not the only one. We need to work on this together. A lot of it might be just kind of shedding, like you said, you spoke to the psychology behind land ownership. And then there's a lot that's systemic about it too. There's a lot of personal work, but there's also systemic. Maybe talk a little bit about the work of the Silk with Agrarian Trust, maybe paring it back a little bit into just the land we need to grow our food and some of those considerations.
Sure.
What are you doing with Agrarian Trust right now? And tell us about it.
So the Agrarian Trust is a new agricultural land trust, and we're their lawyers, but have been working very collaboratively with them to come up with a governance model and a financial model that we hope will be able to shepherd a lot of land into permanent conservation and permanent affordability or accessibility, especially for new farmers, low-income farmers, immigrant farmers. And, the founder is Severin Scharner von Fleming. She is just a very inspiring person, and she came to us and she had this data about the transition of agricultural land, and so much of agricultural land is owned by baby boomers who are retiring starting now, and as they start to retire, they're selling their businesses, they're selling their land. In most cases, in the farm context, it's not going to the next generation as far as their children. A lot of times it's just going onto the speculative market and getting grabbed up by big corporations. So she said about half of the agricultural land, or more than 400 million acres, is likely to change hands in the next 20 years. And so this is like a critical moment in history where all of this wealth is about to move from one group of people to question mark. And I think the default, if we don't actually take action and do something, the default will be the wealthiest percentage of society and large corporations. And so the governance model of the Agrarian Trust is another example of a very distributed governance model, because again, we need farmers and community members organizing in every single community to identify land that they want to conserve for agricultural use and start shepherding it into trusts, either the Agrarian Trust or another trust like it. But at the policy level, we really have to make some change as well, because right now we're sort of relying on people's motivation and on the forces of the market to make this work. But we can use policy to shape the outcomes here. And of course, creating greater financial incentives, tax incentives for land conservation and agricultural use is really important. Lowering the financing barriers. So Sustainable Economies Law Center, since day one, has been focusing a lot on securities law, because securities law dictates who can invest in what businesses and how businesses can raise capital. It basically dictates how wealth can flow, and it dictates what types of enterprises emerge. And so we need to create laws that allow people like, say, me. I have a very small individual retirement account from past jobs. I want to get that out of Wall Street and into local farmland conservation or into permanent real estate cooperatives or other things that are actually going to benefit me in the long term. But there are a lot of financial regulations that impede that. So we do a lot of research on these areas and are hoping to work with more and more clients to help move that wealth. But Agrarian Trust is also thinking a lot about the financing tools. And so from the beginning, we've been talking about creating a separate entity that's really about channeling the financing to the farms.
I love the way you look so systematically at coming up with structures that allow people to participate in new ways that are more long-term, more long view. I wonder if you could tie it in a little bit with the idea of replication and the idea of creating models that are replicable. Mm-hmm. How does an entrepreneur who is creating a viable business conceive of that business in a unconventional way? Maybe a similar idea would be, instead of growing bigger and more consolidated and more efficient and more streamlined to extract profit, looking at more like a Zingerman's model? Or how does the entrepreneur kind of make that shift in their own business or their own thinking, or even in conversations with potential investors or potential CEOs that they're going to onboard?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, actually, podcasts like this one make a difference. I found this out yesterday because another podcaster who has a podcast called Microbrewer, he interviewed me about a year ago about cooperatives and cooperative breweries. He just got an email from someone in Australia who was one of his listeners who said, "Your podcast inspired me to structure our brewery as a cooperative." So,
wow.
So just getting the word out there, creating the narrative, that could make a huge difference, because most people, if they've never heard about cooperatives before, they're not going to think to form a cooperative. And I think even if you hear about it once, it's not enough. You need to start hearing cooperative everywhere, so that when you do start a business, it pops up in your mind as a really viable option. I've had the fortunate experience of seeing this happen. Sustainable Economies Law Center has a walk-in legal advice clinic, and we've now advised 650 organizations, entrepreneurs who come in, and I've probably talked to at least a third of them personally. And so they come in, they say, here's my business idea. And sometimes I haven't even thought about cooperative, but by the time I explain to them what a cooperative is, it's like an aha moment that just sort of like reaches into their core and speaks to the values that they had that they just did not know how to express. And I think in this day and age, people are much less inspired by money. We're more and more self-aware about the fact that money is not going to make us happy. And so creating a model that just maximizes our profits just somehow doesn't feel quite like enough to make us happy. And having healthy workplaces and benefiting our community and knowing that there are legal structures that really basically reorient business toward that, that's very liberating for people. As far as replicability, the Sustainable Economies Law Center, one of the very first things that we did as an organization was start to interview organizations we thought were great models, local currencies, urban farms. And then we thought, we'll write about how they did it. We'll write about the legal steps they took, and then other people can replicate that. So we did all these interviews, and almost every single one churned up something illegal and something really problematic. And we started to realize more and more, wow, the whole legal system is not designed for people to be basically taking democratic control over local resources and creating their own jobs and managing their own renewable energy projects or whatever it might be. And so replicability is hard due to the legal climate that we're in, but we've been working to change that, advocating for a lot of laws that basically smooth the path toward local small-scale business and cooperative business, and then working with clients who we feel like this model can work, it's scalable, it's replicable, we can do it legally, and trying to work with them, clients like the Agrarian Trust, wanting to really work closely with them to get a model that works that other people could then be inspired by and actually replicate.
A great example of one such law that the SELC was at the forefront of is the Cottage Food Law in California, which many Lyft clients have actually really stood on the shoulders of. Can you talk a bit about why that was important, what that was, and maybe an example of how it transformed a business?
Sure. Back in 2011, I learned about cottage food laws. These are laws that let people sell certain foods that they make at home, especially foods that don't have to be refrigerated. I learned that there are a handful of states like Ohio that have such laws, and just knowing how many people were out of work around that time, how many people were actually already selling foods that they make at home, but illegally, I thought, wow, it would be great if California would have a law like this. And so our intern at the time, Christina Oatfield, I sat down with her and I said, how would you like to just try to get one of these laws introduced in California? And that was sort of the beginning of her journey with us. Now she's the second longest term staff member at Sustainable Economies Law Center. She's our policy director, and she really shepherded that bill through the California legislature, which was the first bill we really worked that closely on. And it's very empowering also just to realize, wow, we could make a real difference. And we've worked on a lot of bills since then. But the year following the implementation of that bill, someone did a survey of all, it's roughly 58 health departments in California to find out how many of these businesses had opened under the new law. And it was over 2,000. So just knowing like that has basically opened the door for 2,000 new businesses to start in the open, not, underground. That was just really empowering. And it's also since then, at the time we started to do it, we just felt like regular people. People who had no experience whatsoever in policy making. And it's made us realize also that anybody can be a policy maker. It's really just about us as community members looking around at what do we want, and then getting our voices heard and expressing what it is we want and what the barriers are. This is sort of an orientation we're taking now, is wanting to empower other people to do the same things around the country.
And from my perspective, those businesses are companies like one of Lyft clients, Tortillas de la Tierra, which does chia, quinoa, organic and heirloom, non-GMO tortillas.
Wow.
And it's amazing the types of people that might not have the type of capital to access a commercial kitchen are so frequently correlated with the types of people who have really incredibly strong values, want to make a difference, want to support farmers. So empowering producers, empowering people who are really seeking to create value for their communities in a very tangible food type of way is really beautiful.
Yeah.
Are there any other examples of organizations that you'd just like to share with our listeners that you've worked with in the past that you wake up sometimes and feel like, oh, that was such a great organization. I'm so glad that they exist on the planet.
Oh, there are. There are a lot in my private practice, and sometimes I actually have to get their permission before I could even say that they're my clients. So I can't always go around and just say, that's my client. But it's the lawyer thing. Truthfully, we've worked with so many great clients, though a lot of them have failed in the sense that they just did not keep going and doing business. And so there are also those thoughts that go around in my head. We've worked with 2 catering companies, both of which were worker cooperatives. And at the time, I was so passionate about those companies because I thought catering is a really hard industry on workers in particular. The work can be very sporadic and unpredictable. The wages are pretty low, and it's hard, physically hard work. So we thought worker cooperatives and the catering industry, that's the way to go. And I still feel that way. But in both cases, the cooperatives didn't have access to very much capital. They were bootstrapping their businesses while various members had day jobs. And so many imbalances creeped in as far as like who was doing the work and where the pressure was landing. Conflicts can start to emerge. People just couldn't invest the time and the money into that. And so I can't look at that and just feel like, wow, I created that. But I do, it's motivating in a different kind of a way. I just feeling like I know we were on the right track, but the system's just not ready for it. And we need to do the systemic work to make these things possible.
And obviously, catering is a perfect example of food businesses that sits nestled in a larger construct, right? The caterers that are providing food for people are often, where they're getting their food. If they want to source locally and sustainably food, they're paying higher prices, which means they cannot pay higher wages to their workers. We get this all the time because we work with a lot of food businesses. That's one of the hardest industries to work in because the obstacles are weighted so much not in our favor, almost, I want to say.
Oh my gosh. True.
And when we look at changing the way we perceive wealth, food is one of the places people start.
Yeah. It's a very good place to start since we eat so many times per day. It's like every choice we make around food is an opportunity to make a difference. I've actually been thinking lately that consumers really need to step it up as far as making even more informed choices about what we buy and purchasing, particularly from democratic organizations, from cooperatives. I would actually love it. I wish I had time. I've been kind of trying to do this on the side to get consumers organized, basically a group of consumers who go out and have meals together, or they buy food collectively. And all of those consumers basically commit to spending a certain amount of money every year buying food from worker-owned businesses, worker-owned cooperatives. Because using our leverage as consumers, that's a lot of money. Like if you can get 1,000 members to each say, well, put in $1,000 per year toward purchasing food from cooperatives, we have like $1 million of leverage to try to force businesses or persuade businesses to convert to worker ownership, or help new catering companies, for example, get the support that they needed really early on. Consumer organizing feels really important and kind of a missing piece of the puzzle at the moment.
I love it. I'm going to start telling people I'm a democrivore.
Oh, wow.
I only eat from democratically operated companies. And, there's a really good book out that somewhat relates to this. It's a cookbook called Decolonize Your Diet.
Oh.
And they don't underscore so much the worker ownership, but they do underscore aspects of, it's all about Mexican California cuisine that is plant-based and how we can reclaim our agency over our own health through leveraging traditional knowledge and indigenous diets. And so they do talk about, in the cookbook, they talk about constructs of power, systems of oppression within power structures. And they also talk about the empowerment of being able to forage some of your food. So foraging really nutrient-dense grains like lago verdes and queditas, lamb's quarters and purslane. I think you're onto something. This is the next wave of the consumer revolution. And gosh, what an empowering way to think about spending your money.
Yeah, and I like the democrivore. I am noting the time. Erin coined the phrase, we're democrivore.
Yeah, a definite stepping up of the Eat Local movement. I often think about how can I keep pushing myself in that capacity? Yeah, Yeah, and doing it in community. Two of my dear friends up in Mendocino did a project eating locally for 1 year, Eat Mendocino, Gowan Baptiste and Sarah Bodner, and they found it to be very isolating, honestly, as an experimental approach. You know, they were doing it down to like the salt that they harvested had to be local from Fort Bragg.
Wow.
And so I really love this idea that you have about creating these kind of consumer, it's almost like the Grange style potluck gatherings, going back to supporting one another, and also the transitional ethic of it doesn't have to be perfect all at once, but we can advance towards these ideals.
Yeah.
So in closing, what are some people that you're watching, some thought leadership that you're listening to, some books you're reading, or what are you paying attention to that our listeners might want to take note of?
Let's see. Just recently, I think it's the Movement for Black Lives issued the policy agenda for Black Lives. I'm not giving it the correct title, but so it's a list of policy recommendations. I want to say it's around 30 or 40 policy recommendations that span issues of policing all the way toward economic issues, which is really exciting. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations get behind that. So that could be a good thing to take a look at and maybe endorse. Hang on one second, and I will tell you that it is Movement for Black Lives Policy Platform. Let's see. Another thing that I like right now is there's a book called Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, Laloux. He also just put out the illustrated version. Just such a really inspiring book. It profiles roughly 15 businesses, many of them large scale around the world, that have very decentralized governance structures, and just how the various characteristics that they share across the board, which are very similar to what we've created at Sustainable Economies Law Center. To me, it's just very exciting to see how it's worked in so many places. And almost everyone I know who reads that book gets really excited about it.
You mentioned this Movement for Black Lives policy agenda, and that really strikes a chord with me, and I'm sure most of our listeners would also love to know more about that. What are some other, and maybe you don't know them all right now, but what are some of the recommendations or the aspects that they're talking about that you're calling up right now that you could share with some of our listeners?
Oh, here's a good one. Through tax incentives, loans, and other government-directed resources, support the development of cooperative and social economy networks. I mean, I just love that they're really hitting economic structures. Another one is a right to restored land, clean air, clean water, and housing, and an end to exploitative privatization of natural resources. It's really getting to the economic heart of racism, both how our economic systems are reinforcing racism, reinforcing prejudices, and vice versa. So I think it's going to strike a chord with a lot of people and hopefully get to this tipping point that I mentioned earlier, where a lot of people are realizing if we really want to change this, people who are feeling deeply moved by everything that's happening in the country right now, like if we really want to change it, we really need to be talking about economics, business structures, ownership structures, private property, and all of these things.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So grateful for your leadership and service in that regard. You've really, and the SELC, all 12 worker owners, 14 worker owners, 12, that have really brought these issues to the forefront and brought them to light. I know you do so much outreach, you teach places, you have your open cafes that people can access, that entrepreneurs can access, and you have all your guidebooks that you've created online that address land access and home ownership and food laws. So thank you so much for your leadership in all those ways. So anything to add about how people can get in touch, can access the resources of the SELC, and can stay in touch with you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for your support and your enthusiasm and just helping bring more visibility, or audibility, I guess in this case, to our work. And people can go to our website. It's theselc.org, theselc.org. We also have a lot of legal resource websites that are linked from there, but it's communityenterpriselaw.org, urbanaglaw.org, and things like that.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.